we talked a lot last time about verse, really, because, as we said, this is the first time that we have really talked about an author, an English author, poet, so that we haven't had to talk about the matter of verse before. And we were just saying that if you're to become habituated to it, to get in the habit of reading verse, we were just saying before we turned the tape on that what you really need to do is to get hold of an anthology of English verse, English poetry, and just read through that anthology. You know, when I was in the military, I went into the Army when I was 17, and I remember that I got a set of I got a 4-volume anthology of English literature, and I spent 2 years reading that from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, you know, from the beginning to the end. It was a marvelous experience. I still remember doing that. I finally had time. I had a lot of time, and I just read that anthology.
Well, it's true. There is such a thing as the English anthology.
Yeah.
In fact, again, what does the word anthology mean? I suppose it has that same beginning in it that anthropos has. That is, it's the ology that makes you look up.
Yeah.
It's an anthology, and there is such a thing. The most famous one is the Greek anthology, and I have no idea who ordered that. I suppose it was done by the Alexandrian scholars, the late Hellenistic period, who looked back on the whole history of Greek literature and summed it up and put it into the Greek anthology is nothing but verse, Greek verse, and that's a very, very good thing to do. People have imitated it ever since. Perhaps in decadent ages, I suppose. That is, when poetry is at its liveliest, there isn't any anthology because people sing it in the streets. Nobody thinks of collecting. But in an age like ours, where we have come to the end of something, people do then look back and say, well, these are the chestnuts that we take from the fire. Have I got the right metaphor or not? I guess so.
Chestnuts, yeah.
These are the...
Well, they call them, let's see, what's the other name? They used to call them florilegium.
Yes.
Or it's florilegia, to use the plural. The florilegium, which means flowers. It's a selection of flowers.
Collection of flowers, yeah.
Well, what's the English?
Bouquet, really. I mean, kind of bouquet.
Yeah. They use all of those expressions to describe, because it goes back. They did them. Well, they were in Latin. They were Latin florilegia, of not only of poetry but of sayings of the fathers and the saints and famous people and all that kind of thing. And they are. We're advocates of reading great books, and we try to read them whole. But then the books that we're choosing to read are books that pretty much do have to be read whole, or they can be read in part. We're not going to go all the way through the Canterbury Tales, but it is broken up into tales, and there really isn't any very much continuity in the tales. But when it comes to reading lyric poetry or short poems, then you really do need an anthology. Mr. Senior has here open in front of him a book called the Oxford Anthology of English Poetry.
I noticed the author here, the editor here, calls it N Oxford Anthology. He doesn't call it the Oxford. Now, there is a the Oxford. I think there are about 25 different Oxford anthologies. And he not only does he call it N Oxford, but he italicizes the word N. Yeah, I think he wants to make it clear that this is his selection rather than some kind of definitive canon.
Right.
On the other hand, it really is a definitive canon. This was chosen and edited by Howard Foster Lowry, the College of Worcester, and Willard Thorpe, Princeton University.
Oh, they were good guys. I mean, they're old timers. That's been out of print for quite a while.
That's
Mr. Nellick used to use it in his poetry class.
I'm surprised it is out of print. You just mentioned that. It was in print right up until 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I suppose it will disappear. This came out in 1956.
Mm-hmm.
And the first edition came out in 1935, so it goes back that far. And that's half a century.
Yeah.
I'm afraid you better beware when you buy anthologies, because obviously they can be abused by crafty editors who make selections according to their own ideologies. There's a lot of that around, I'm afraid, ideological anthologies. Women's liberation people are now cranking out a whole new version of civilization.
Yeah, well, they're right now one of the hottest topics in the study of literature is the canon. If you ever hear of anybody talking about the canon of English literature, you better look out.
They're challenging.
They want to revise and they want to say, well, why should we read Chaucer after all? The heck with Chaucer. There must have been a good female writer back there in the 14th century that we can read, and so forth. They really are trying to revise it radically.
So hold on to the tradition, whatever you do.
Well, the other thing, too, is that very often you find in recent anthologies, I suspect there is another Oxford anthology.
I'm afraid so.
Complete. But what you're going to find is that probably a third of it, at least, is made up of really modern poets. I mean, after T.S. Eliot.
Right.
T.S. Eliot is no longer really a modern poet. You're going to find that...
See, this anthology ends with, I'm not sure, I'm going to say maybe Dylan Thomas, but...
it probably does, yeah.
It is. It does have,
There's Dylan
Thomas, and that was considered rather daring.
Yeah.
He was in 1935. Well, I'm sorry, because this last poem was written in 1946, so this anthology was revised for its second edition. So 1946 brings it up through Stephen Spender, W.H. Auden, C.J. Lewis, and T.S. Eliot. But these are considered the most modern poets of the day. But as you say, the ones coming out now will bring it right up to 1980.
Well, not only that, but then that will occupy a disproportionate.
Given credit, it does not. In this
no, it's very little.
Very little. Right.
I would say, because this is out of print, that another anthology, which we like very much, though it isn't really the same as this anthology, is the anthology by Walter de la Mare called Come Hither. Come Hither. Now that is still in print.
Mm-hmm.
You can get that in England, or you can get it in Canada, and it may be available in the United States. Now it's a more personal kind of.
It's not the canon at all.
No, it isn't the canon.
Although
it has.
It has a lot of chestnuts.
Chestnuts.
But it also has a lot of poems you never would have heard.
Oh, absolutely. And they're usually remarkable.
Well, but that's a personal selection.
But it's a personal selection.
A very remarkable man who was himself a considerable poet.
Yeah, and it has absolutely delightful notes. The notes are, we never advise reading notes, but his notes are kind of poetic commentary on the poetry.
It's kind of course in a way in how to read poetry.
It really is, yeah. Mm-hmm. He has a remarkable introduction about kind of a little allegory about a little boy who discovers poetry at the beginning of the book, and then this rather sizable anthology, and with no footnotes at all, and then some notes at the back. Whereas this Oxford anthology does have a lot of footnotes, explanatory footnotes, but not much in the way of scholarly apparatus to its credit.
They're not bad.
No, it's not objective.
They tell you who people are.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Well, and the Walter de la Mare anthology is really strictly lyrical poetry.
Yeah.
There is nothing in there but lyrical.
Well, this Oxford anthology does. It is the canon. I think that's the difference. We have to say that everybody ought to know the names of the poets in this book. They're listed more or less chronologically, although not exactly. I was pleased to note that sometimes the editors cluster poets because they knew each other, and then actually cluster others and get the chronology out of sync, which is kind of nice, but not too much. That is by and large. It's at least by centuries. It starts with Chaucer and moves pretty much on up to the present. And as you look, through the book, you get Edmund Spenser, Spenser, Edmund Spenser. Well, everybody ought to know the name Edmund Spenser, and they ought to know that he wrote this big long thing. And it's anthologized here. It's not given in its entirety. You can't read it in its entirety.
No.
It's an unreadable poem.
Well, it's unfinished.
Anyway, but you ought to know, and maybe sample and say, well, now I know what people mean when they say Spenserian, because it's important. Now, Spencer's reputation has sunk in the last 100 years. He was 200 years ago, in the time of the Romantics, considered England's second greatest poet, I guess, right after Milton.
Now he is wildly popular with the Romantics.
Well, okay. Who knows? Maybe he'll come back, but at the moment, as far as we're concerned, he's pretty well sunk. But still, you could make fun of Edmund Spenser, but you want to know who he is. I mean, you would be ignorant of the English tradition if you didn't know what he did, and admit, if you read a few of these stanzas, that what he does superbly. That's why it's called Spenserian.
Well, he is a great master of verse. Again, he is a great master of verse. At times, you think that's all he's a master of, but he is unquestionably a great master of verse. But this is a great big volume. It's over 1,000 pages, and I know Mr. Millick used to say, well, this has got everything in it you'd ever want to know.
That's right.
This is everything you'd like to read all of Paradise Lost, and all of Paradise Lost is not in there. And someday you should read all of Paradise Lost. Maybe even you should read the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen or something like that.
Now you're going too far.
Well, I didn't say all of it.
Yeah.
but you don't. But the thing is that if you knew the material in that volume, you would have a real poetic education so far as English literature is concerned.
Don't you think that's true? I mean, everybody ought to have this book or its equivalent, and that is a book of the standard English poets. And you ought to read them, and you ought to know them, and that's that.
Yeah.
Now, if in addition to that, you have a favorite poet, then you go out and buy his collected works. But it is a mistake, and it's one that I myself made. A lot of young people get hooked on the intellectual life, the literary life anyway, and they think that the thing to do is to buy books. And I went out and bought beautiful collected editions. I bought the famous collected edition of John Donne with the notes in the second volume. Who's the guy? Grierson. Oh, Grierson. And I must say, really still to this day, pretty much know the John Donne poems that are in here.
Yeah.
Pretty much, even though, and I became a professional, but I would say that really there was very little need for me to have done that. At one time, maybe I did actually, as a professor, when I had to teach Donne, I did then make use of that book. But as a reader, I never would have made use of it. I have a whole bunch of those books. Great big things. And years ago, I had a grateful student, which is kind of a rare thing in some ways, although in recent years we've had more of them. But from my earlier career, I had a grateful student who bought me the collected volumes of Wordsworth. And it's unbelievable. It's about 6 volumes. And it is, again, totally unbelievable. Totally unbelievable. And Wordsworth is a great poet. I admire Wordsworth. But those volumes almost made me lose him. And they were so depressing. So I don't know. Don't go out and buy a lot of books, but this one anthology would do you well. You go from, I don't know, I'm just skipping through it. Ben Jonson. Well, everybody ought to know Ben Jonson. John Donne, John Milton. I'm skipping, just turning pages. John Dryden. Now again, Dryden is really out of fashion. I don't suppose anybody's going to read a lot of him.
No.
But anybody would admit that he's one of the most important and excellent poets in the English language, and again, a writer of verse. Thomas Gray. Now let's stop on Thomas Gray, because we picked him out as his poem is only really great poem, Elegy Written in a Country Church Yard. We had our students memorize that whole poem. It's a long poem. These verses are numbered. The last number is 110, so it's about 120. It's about 120 lines of standard English verse. You might ask, why did we have our students memorize this poem? Well, because it is the quintessential English poem, and it sums up a lot of things. It's a conventional poem. It's nothing original or shocking or even great about it. It's an ordinary poem that sums up in a placid, sort of even-handed way just about everything that poetry does. And we were talking last time about verse. You can't do. There's no better way to learn English verse than to memorize that poem.
Yeah, well, that is one of the ways. We've said this before. I know at some point that of course, in giving you these lectures, we're not giving you everything that we did in the integrated humanities, because one of the things we did was to have students memorize poetry, and we've, I think, at times expressed the hope that in listening to these tapes that you will also memorize poems, because there isn't any substitute for doing that. Just reading a poem is not the same thing as having the poem in your memory, so that you live with it. It's there, always there. We say in your heart. It's something you have by heart. There just isn't any substitute for that, and that has been characteristically what everyone has always done who has had a poetic education, as so many people have had. They have committed a great deal of poetry to memory, and this is one of the poems, probably one of the most memorized poems in English literature. Probably the most memorized single, substantial poem that it has been memorized and quoted endlessly.
It's memorable.
Yeah, because it is memorable. It is very memorable.
We were talking last time about verse, which is not the same thing as poetry. And this poem is both. It's a poem and it's verse. And you can learn both of them at the same time just by memorizing it. The difficulty with Chaucer, we also did ask our students to memorize that first sentence of the Canterbury Tales, but the difficulty there is that the language is old-fashioned. That is, it's what we call Middle English, a kind of transitional phase of the English language between the really Old English, which is a Germanic, rather barbaric, certainly uncivilized language, and modern English, which really appears for the first time, well, roughly in the time of Shakespeare. That is
200 years later, at least, after Chaucer.
And Chaucer really, Middle English really doesn't exist. That is, there are half a dozen poets who wrote it, but it really is a scholar's invention. There was something called Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, and then there's something called Modern English, and then there's this thing in the middle, which didn't last very long. And the only reason we pay any attention to it really is that Chaucer, especially, wrote in it, and two other poets We should mention Piers the Plowman, which is harder to read than Chaucer. The dialect is even harder than Chaucer, but still, it is a great poem written in something that you could pour into this notion of Middle English. And then there was another poet, we call him the Pearl poet, who is very obscure. We don't know his name, and we're not even sure that he wrote anything except the Pearl, but scholars attribute other poems to him, and among them a beautiful poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Which we probably will talk about. I think we'll probably talk about that later.
But don't we read that in translation?
We read that in translation.
It's so hard.
That's impossible.
It's so hard, yeah.
Oh.
See, there say Middle English really doesn't exist.
No. It's a northern dialect. It's a northern dialect.
Much harder than Chaucer.
I took a course in which we read it, and it was a delightful poem, but the language is really very. You have to look up every other word in that poem, although it's not much earlier. It's a little earlier, I think, than Chaucer, but it's just that it's a northern dialect. So you get various dialects.
Yeah, that's why I was saying that Middle English doesn't exist. I mean, there are these three poets, and they're very different.
Yeah, and their language is even very different. Yeah.
But I sidetracked on that. But what I was saying was, if you want to learn English verse, you have to memorize some standard English chestnuts. And Chaucer is not a good choice because of the dialect. Neither, for that matter, would Robert Burns, for the most of his poems, be a good choice because of the dialect, I suppose. I don't. Do we have to memorize Burns? I suppose
we did. We did. Yes.
Because some of his poems are more English than others, of course. I'm sure we did.
My love is like the red, red rose.
Oh, we had to memorize
Yeah.
that. And that's almost English.
Yeah, there's very little in there that's
very little Scottish.
Yeah.
But I mean, Burns is a very, very great poet. But he wrote a lot of Scottish dialect, and it's wonderful stuff. And anybody who wants to go into it and fool around with it will have a delightful time. But it throws you off a little bit. What we want to do is find an easy poem, something that isn't so difficult that you spend time on the poem. What we want is something rather conventional that just carries you along so that you learn the standard, and having learned the standard, then you can apply it. Well, for example, John Donne is another example of a very, very great poet. But for the most part, we didn't ask our students to memorize him.
I think they memorized "Death Me Not Proud," but that's a rather standard type of poem too. It isn't. It's a sonnet. Yeah. It's a sonnet, and it's an easy poem for John Donne. It isn't as complex as.
Because most of the stuff, the versification is so baroque. That is, it's arty. It's extremely mannered. Isn't that the word they use? Or that is, he was a self-conscious artist, and he fools around so that you really sometimes lose the scansion. That is, you don't. I mean, again, I'm a professional, and I have to stop and read the poem again. I said, "Wait a minute, where are we?"
He changes in the middle of the poem. And every poem is different. Every poem is a new piece of verse. He never, you get to someone like Gray, and well, he always writes the same line, just as Chaucer always writes the same verse. He writes 10-syllable lines. They're in couplets. They're rhymed in couplets.
John Donne is pyrotechnical, and he's marvelous. And once you learn the standard, then you realize what he's doing. But if you don't know the standard, you just get lost and you can't handle it. So what we would expect people to do would be to pick out a couple of rather easy poems and just say, look, memorize them. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Now you can stop on that line. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. That is so regular that it's unbelievable. That is, it's almost it's an iambic pentameter line. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd wind slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now, before going further, I have to say that's also marvelous poetry. It's not only verse. I mean, he has images. You are moved into the world of the imagination, and to that Virgilian world,
yes.
Something sad and twilight and
lonely.
This is not the
rural.
English tradition, rural, but this is the tradition with a capital T, right out of Virgil. And so it's a marvelous poem. When I said it was conventional, I certainly didn't mean to disparage it. I mean, it's a marvelous poem, one of the best. And, remember, was it Dr. Johnson who didn't think much of Thomas Gray's other poetry, and when the country churchyard came out, somebody showed it to him, and he was astonished. And he said, well, if you'd written like that all the time, he said, I'd revise my opinion about it. I mean, even Johnson had to admit that, boy, this was really something. I guess it astonished everybody how good it was. Well, if you just memorize those first four lines, you learn a great deal about English verse. You get that sense of da-dum, 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 da-dum. Now, most English verse is written in couplets. This is written in quatrains, which are two couplets jammed into each other. That is, it goes A, B, A, B instead of A, A, B, B, the way we identify rhyme. So you get the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the rhythm, the verse there, the meter sort of lifts up at the end of the line, and then the second one, the lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. Now that would be your typical couplet. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. And you stop. That's a couple. And then you start again. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But this one fools you. That is, it's a quatrain rather than a couplet, and the rhyme doesn't exactly follow the meter. You get the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. Now, lea and day don't rhyme. The plowman homeward plods his weary way. Now we've got day and way, and leaves the world of darkness in to me. So here you get a linkage of the two lines that go up, and then a linkage of the two that go down. And he does that all through those 120 lines of the poem, and majestically. And you really do finally get on to the motion of the verse. You pointed out last time, I think, that the word verse, meaning turn, probably derives from wheel.
Possibly.
I never thought of that.
Possibly. I don't know. I've thought about it a long time, but it's the repetition.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, the poem wheels. There's a marvelous steadiness about it. Now he varies it, of course. That is, the wheel will squeak and wiggle and wobble and turn corners, but still, it will always be there.
It's a kind of background that's always there. When you first memorize poetry, the best thing to do is to be rather sing-songy about it and emphasize it, and read it with the accent very heavily on them, and then you want to get away from that eventually, but you want to first get that beat established in your mind, that motion.
Even if you have to mispronounce words a little bit.
Yeah. And then later on, you forget about that. It's like dancing. At first you're very conscious about the steps, and then you begin to take it for granted. And then what happens is it becomes much more subtle. That is, you emphasize words differently. The emphasis is not even across these lines. Some words will be emphasized more heavily than others, so that there's great variety within this repetition of. Obviously, if you read the whole poem, it would just be so monotonous. It would drive you crazy.
And you can't do it because the
no.
poet deliberately emphasizes some words.
Yeah,
forces you not.
You have to in reading it. If you read it aloud again, or you recite it aloud, you'll find that certain words have to be emphasized more than other words.
I'll just take a look at the second line here. For example, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Now that is about as close to dump as the English language can get. That is, little words like the have the slack syllables, and the strong words like kerf and knell and so on have the beat. But in the very second line, notice what he does. The low in heard, okay, it's the same thing. The low in heard wind slowly over the lead. Now you can't take the word wind and force that down. That is, it should be the low in heard wind, slow wind, W-I-N-D, wind. Slow, you can't do it. So that you have to say wind slow. That is, it forces you, when you actually read the poem, to make wind and slow more or less equal. Well, that's a common device in English poetry. It has a name. We call it the spondee. Yeah. And it's a kind of an equal stress. If you think about it, of course, Gray certainly thought about it. He's an artist, and he thought that's a perfect word to slow the beat down with. After all, that's what he's talking about. The herd doesn't run; it winds, and so sure enough, the verse slows down. Oh, I wouldn't push that too far. I mean, you begin to get into kind of silly interpretations of poems when you do that. But I think in this case, though, I think we have to say that Gray probably did think of that. He was a highly conscious metrist, and probably he did that. The plowman homeward. There's another one, I think. You can't say the plow homeward. Well, maybe you can.
A little less accent. I know. I took a whole course in versification. A very sophisticated woman who did this. She was very good at it. Had a marvelous ear for that sort of thing. And she would use half accent. She'd put the little diagonal mark to the right, and then on word she would have put on home. She would have put the main accent. Then she'd have put a half accent on.
It's a little more than
a
slack, but on the other hand, it's not up to wind slow.
Yeah.
Well. Of course, any attempt to count, any attempt to measure, to mathematicize this is bound to fail. We're dealing with an art, not a science. And certainly it's not a mechanism. We're not winding up a clock. We never can exhaust the subtleties. That is, the basic clock is there, the basic beat is there, but what the poet does with it, according to the feel of the English language, is something much, much too subtle.
Well, it's like the metronome. You use the clock, and when you start learning to play the piano or anything, you use the metronome. And it goes tick, 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 tick. You set it at a certain speed, and it goes at that speed, and you play it mechanically at that speed, and you're starting to learn it. And then once you've got it, once you learn how to handle that time, then you forget about it.
But Paderewski didn't use them as concerts. I don't suppose.
No, you forget it. It's still there, though. It's still there. You can, if you stop, if you try, you can hear that metronome still ticking back there. You never lose. You never. My teacher used to say the meter goes marching on. She said it marches on. There's that steady marching sound of the music, and that may be another source of the.
Well, poetry is allied to dancing and to steps. There's no question, and certainly to music. We're all together here. It's time art. Somebody, was it Lessing or somebody, divided the arts into the spatial and the time. Was that how he put it? I forget. But it moves in time, and therefore it has a beat. And the word metric does simply mean measure. It means an attempt to count. Like the water meter is a meter. It's a measuring device that tells you how much water is flowing. But water meters, let's go back to our attack on science. Actually, they don't measure very accurately. That is, you can't measure water. You can't. There's no way you can measure the flow of water. Heraclitus went through that all the way back in Asia Minor, 3,000 years ago. There's no way that you can measure the river because it never stops. On the other hand, measuring is very useful indeed, and we can say, well, that's more or less a gallon of water there that went by, and we can say of English poetry that most of it is iambic pentameter, and the word pentameter means pentameter, it means 5 measures per line. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea, the ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now the word end in that last line there is the opposite.
Yeah.
There, a small word is lifted up to bear more than it would normally bear.
But we do that. We do that in language all the time. We say,
emphasis.
"I want you and him to come. I want both of you. I want you and that." You stress the and. Now it isn't stressed that heavily there. I don't.
But again,
but he does.
Your
want
teacher would say it's a half stress.
But he wants it to have a little stress. And to me.
Leaves the world to darkness. There's a kind of a pause there. And to me, that is the author of the poem, the one who's writing the meditation.
Also, the other thing that you notice are the sounds. That's, as you listen to that, it's full of owls and ohs. It's full of L's.
Oh, thanks.
The O's is very, very pronounced in that low sound, the lowing and the toes,
plowman,
the L, the L there, the plod.
Yeah, there are L's all over the place.
And W's, those rather full sounds that you get in the English language when you
homeward and
L's and W's are kind of they're very pronounced.
Yeah, you've got wind and ward in the word homeward and weary, way, world. He's got them all over the place.
Yeah, it's very melodic. It's very mellifluous sounding, beautiful. It has a beautiful sound. It's just a pleasure to listen to it without even paying any attention to what it means. The sheer sound of it is delightful to
Yes.
hear.
You know, the last time we were talking about writing jingles, that everybody ought to write verse. Once upon a time, everybody wrote bad verse. Yards and yards of very, very bad verse. Brought up on the English anthology.
They imitated
it. And they weren't poets. And they overdid it usually. That is, it got lush and rather ridiculous.
If you try to do that sound business with the alliteration and all of that,
you'll
fall into something else.
Bathos and whatever. There's a whole vocabulary for bad poetry. I remember I had a relative who wrote long, epic poems for every occasion. and who his feelings would be hurt if you didn't think it was great. And he even published them. That is, he got local printers to print them up. Christmas was an occasion always for his Christmas poem. And for one thing, he didn't know when to stop. They were 150 lines long, like Gray's Elegy, and they were full of sound, signifying that it was mostly, just noise and sentimental, terribly sentimental feelings, overflows of feelings. But as I look back on it now, at the time I was a young fellow, this was a man of my parents' generation, and oh, how I despised him. And now I kind of envy him. I wish I could do it, That is, by golly, there was something to that. There was something. He wasn't self-conscious. He wasn't ashamed, let's say, as I would be, of something like that. And I'm sure every family must have had 2 or 3 of those guys who wrote those things. And I think that's wonderful. To have good poets, you have to have bad poets. And we all ought to do that.
Well, the absence, really, of bad poets among just very ordinary people is a sure sign that there's not very much good poetry around. or even much good verse around. The verse has to be something cultivated, and it has to be in the education system. It has to be in the culture itself. It has to be in everyday life, so that it's normal, it's ordinary for people to versify. But it isn't anymore. If you want someone to do that, they have to strain to do it. It has to be forced. They have to sit down and they have to work at it. Whereas this man, I'm sure, just wrote those verses
that's it.
out.
He didn't have to go. Now wait a minute.
Yeah,
How many have I
or
got there?
well, let's see. What can I get to rhyme with sing or
Right,
ring
right.
or whatever?
No,
That just came out.
Sing, ring,
Just
ring. He had them all. You know.
normal.
No, it was there. And what's more, it was verse.
Yeah.
That is, it went to up. I mean, it was not. What I've noticed in a lot of modern poetry is that it's simply not versatile. I mean, on the professional poets who I've often, I go to the library every now and then because I make appointments with people and it's a convenient place to meet. Somebody told me after they got it, you might get a terrible reputation doing that sort of thing nowadays, but it's a perfectly good, sensible place to meet. And therefore, if someone happens to be late or I'm early or whatnot, pick up a book. And I usually pick up verse. I want to see what the poets are doing. So I go over there and I get out a nice little slim volume that was published just this month. And I find myself, when I look at it, saying over and over again, well, that's a good idea for a poem. Why didn't he make it into a poem? Mm-hmm. That is, you get little sketches in prose of an idea for a poem. But they don't, they've lost it. They don't have that old tradition in their blood. I don't think that's true of absolutely all of them, but as we were saying last time, light verse has just about dropped out of our lives, and so I think now so is bad verse. It's just bad verse. You might even make a defense of sentimentality along these lines. That is, in order to have fine feelings, you have to have a lot of bad feelings, sloppy feelings, vulgar feelings.
Yeah.
The last generation of masters, our masters, T.S. Eliot, for example, really dominated English literature in the middle years of the 20th century. Between the wars, T.S. Eliot dominated English literature, and he was a fastidious person, just pinched almost. He knew it himself and criticized himself for it, but he made us all ashamed of being anything else, so that we suppressed emotion of any kind. I mean, we confused sentimentality with emotion, and so afraid were we that somebody would say, "Oh, you're being sentimental," that we pinched ourselves. I remember T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia. I didn't like T.S. Eliot's poems. He knew how good they were. He was a remarkable man, T.E. Lawrence was, and knew a lot about literature. And in one of his letters, he says, I read Through the Wasteland the other day, and I must say it's a remarkable poem, but what bothers me is that every time he starts to say something that he really feels, he sprinkles it with oyster shells. And in the poem, he has something about oyster shells, doesn't he? Or is that Prufrock? It's in one of his poems where he talks about a bar. I don't know, something
oyster shells on the floor.
On the floor, yeah. And he says he sprinkles oyster shells all over his feelings so that nobody will catch him. And I think that's true. That is, he starts to say something moving, and then he says something witty immediately to show you that he's laughing at himself before you do.
Irony. He spoke of irony.
This poem of Gray would be criticized today as being one, conventional, but two, also, I don't know whether they go so far as to say it was sentimental, but I think they would say that it's not, certainly not refined enough or sophisticated.
Oh yeah, well they would say it's
Certainly not ironic.
No, not at all. But you know about the part where he talks about the children climbing on the father's knee, you know, and that sort of thing. That is sentimental. I've forgotten where it is. It's quite a ways.
Yeah, here he's talking about the dead in the churchyard, and he says, "For them, no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envy kiss to share." Oh, today, a housewife plying her care. We could hear those women's livers just snarling. Oh, that one, you know, they would tear that to shreds with their fingernails. You know, those harpies, they couldn't stand that. Busy housewife ply her evening care, or even but the word lisp. The little baby babbling. Oh, they would say, "Oh, come on, baby's lisp." Now, maybe people who talk, baby talk, cloy. I agree. You know, sure, there's such a thing as sentimentality, and people who write poems about baby talk are annoying. But, well, sentimentality is not the worst thing.
Yeah, you have to have it. If you're going to have the real thing, then you're definitely going to have excesses of it. If you're going to have genuine emotion, then you are certainly going to have excesses of emotion. But if you have the defect of emotion, then you're not going to have any emotion at all.
That's right.
You're not going to have it. And
you've got an effort. But get that on tape.
I've forgotten it already.
I know, but that's true. No, that is really true. That's true of everything, isn't it? That is, the defect is impossible.
Well, Ben Jonson says
you can restrain.
Yes.
But what is that famous couplet about? He's got the curb and the bit, but where's the bloody horse?
Where's the He has the snaffle in the bit, but where's the bloody horse? Ben Jonson says somewhere it's in his prose writings. He says you can excess you can always curb in writing. He says you can always curb excess, but if you have a defect, if you know